Welcome back to the Law News Network, everybody. Aaron Keller here with you for the rest of the afternoon as we continue to cover two trials. First, the Morris Brothers trial in Phoenix, Arizona. The second, the Holly Bobo trial that you've been watching this afternoon. The defense just rested its case, and we're waiting to see here if there's going to be a prosecutor's rebuttal. It'll be interesting to see if there is one and what that would entail. But the bottom line, we are very near the end. It's possible we could see some of the closing arguments as soon as a few minutes from now. This judge usually takes breaks of about 15 minutes, and while we are in the break, we want to bring another guest here onto the Law News Network. Burton Staggs is a news director for WOPC HD News, a local radio station near where this trial is happening in Tennessee. And Burton, we've been talking a lot off camera, but I want to welcome you officially here on the phone to the Law News Network.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been talking about a lot of things here, and just to sort of retrace some of the steps, my first big question that I don't get to see here, and I admit that my perspective is limited, but what's the mood on the ground in this community with this trial happening?
I just actually came from the Decatur County Courthouse, and the mood and the setting is they're ready for this to be over. But as one of the older gentlemen told me, he's not meaning that in a disrespectful way. He said, it just needs to end.
This community's been living with this for years and years and years. We're going all the way back to, what, 2011 when she was missing originally?
April 13 of 2011, 6 years.
So that's a long time, and it's horrible to live through anything like this. It's probably more horrible for a community to live through it for this long. We all understand that. But the question now isn't so much what happened to Holly Bobo as it is whether or not this defendant is getting a fair trial. Now, I know that they're so tightly woven together that it's impossible to unwind them. But is there a sense there locally that people are treating this defendant with his constitutional presumption of innocence? Or is this one of these places where everybody's been talking about this for 6 years and they're just ready to lock this guy up and throw away the key?
I think it's a little of both. It depends on where you're at. The closer you get to Decatur County, for the most part, they're ready to lock him up and throw away the key. As you get into the outlying areas, the more of the let's give him a fair trial, let's be open-minded comes into play.
Has there been any backlash at the investigators, the prosecutor, anyone who's handled the investigation or the prosecution?
Over the past few days, there seems to be a strong backlash at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation over the way it was handled.
Why is that?
As a lot of people that's been watching the trial knows, the former lead agent, Terry Britt, he testified that he became solely focused on Terry Dykes. He become so focused on an individual with the last name of Britt, and he just did not do his due diligence on the four that are involved in this case.
So it's more of a backlash that he should have been investigating the four defendants who ultimately have faced charges, and not a backlash that he should have been investigating other suspects?
Yes, the backlash is that they knew the Tennessee Highway Patrol had already been to Zach Adams in 3 or 4 days and had been looking at different things, and that this agent and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation spent most of their resources going in a complete different direction.
Well, I mean, that's their job, though. They have to look at all the possible suspects to make sure they've got the right one.
Right. And I think the backlash comes from the fact that they didn't check out the alibis properly of these four. If they had done that, they would have saw that it was falling apart.
Do people believe the prosecution's case in chief? In other words, that Jason Autry was involved a little bit, but that this defendant was the guy who did all of the worst stuff? Or are people sitting there saying, hey, look, almost every one of the state's key witnesses has got something to gain by lying, and they're all pointing the finger one way and the next, and it's really not possible to prove who exactly did what?
Definitely the latter of what you said. The vast majority of the people you talk to, they may feel like they've got the right people, but they say we'll probably never know the truth, and that who did what to who, it will never be known.
You talked about something off camera with me, and I want to jump into this a little bit to dig into it. You said that there's something about this case that just doesn't smell right. What is that?
It's just that some of the things, I call it the alphabet soup. How did we have and in no disrespect to any case that's ever existed, but we've got a 20-year-old victim who walks into the woods, who is presumed kidnapped, and suddenly we have ATF, TBI, you name the alphabet soup, and they're on this case instantly. There's a lot of questions about this case.
There's a lot of questions about it, and it seemed to me that the investigation took off in a rather slow manner. You've got the initial responding officer, the 911 center or whatever the public safety building is, and fax a request for cell phone information. In most places, this happens instantaneously. Roadblocks get put up. They turn around and say there's been an abduction. We know that there's a certain circumference here. We got to deal with it. We've got to get cell phone records with immediate access, and we've got to jump in on it right away. So some of the backlash you talked about with the TBI doesn't necessarily surprise me, but we're talking about things that just don't smell right with all this, in your phrase, alphabet soup of agencies. We're talking about some other thing here. What's up with this? The defendant having to move in with a friend of the Bobo families who was also a retired police officer.
If we to believe the prosecution in our opening statement, and from what I've looked into, Dylan Adams, the brother of Zachary Adams, was in federal custody. A deal was struck that he moved in with a fellow by the name of Dennis Benjamin. He later confessed to Dennis Benjamin. And that's where a lot of this case began.
Well, that's another interesting wrinkle that I have not come across in my research, but it raises questions as to exactly what's going on here. I mean, is this an impartial investigation? Is the confession good? How did the whole thing play out?
It raises a lot of questions. I hate to answer your question with a question, but it just raises questions, doesn't it?
I would say so. I like to sit in the position of asking them more than answering, but it's and you do too, because you're a news director in a local radio station. So
Right.
Look, I mean, the whole media food chain falls apart if we don't have good local journalists on the ground, and we were talking about that a little bit. So how does somebody like you, who sits in the position of trying to run a newsroom with all of this, I don't want to say insanity, but this is a high pressure situation going on in a small community. How do people like you try to keep facts separate from fiction in that hurricane?
In my case, I can only speak for me, but what I've done is really tried to work the backside of the story, to go to the people that are involved. Over the last 6 or 7 months, I've sat down with family, relatives, friends, foes, villains, all sides of it, and talk to them and say, okay. And then I go back and I compare my notes and say, hey, okay, this lines up, and this lines up. And I don't know if you know it, but I actually broke the testimony of Jason Autry the morning of the opening of the trial. And I'd had that for a few months by just working background sources, and I just tried to do good old-fashioned reporting.
Well, we certainly need it. Now, let's talk about a couple of the bombshells that Jason Autry dropped here, because he dropped this one thing, and most of us here just sort of blew up in our chairs hearing it on the witness stand, where he claimed that Clint Bobo, Holly's brother, knew that or was starting to get involved with these guys in this drug operation, and that's why Holly was screaming, was because she was upset about it. Now, we're sitting here saying, okay, well, if it's true, because that's a big if, all right, you know, like is that true? Like, why would that happen? Nobody attacked it, so that leads me to believe, well, maybe it's not true, and that's why the defense isn't trying to play that angle a little bit. But then if he's lying on the witness stand, that hurts his credibility from the prosecution's standpoint. So if you don't mind sharing it with us, what's your theory as to why Autry dropped that bombshell on the witness stand, claiming that Holly Bobo, the victim's own brother, was somehow involved with these guys?
I think it's twofold. I think that he heard this from Zach Adams, and like I said, you haven't been there for all the testimony, but Zach told a lot of different versions of the truth. I think Zach told him this version to lessen the fact that we didn't just go there to rape and kidnap some young lady. I think he needed to justify it. I also think maybe there's a little shot across the bow in this case. Autry seems very vindictive. And the reason I find it to be false, or that I've laid back to it, is another testimony that was given later. And I'm going to watch, you need to beep this out. But when Zach Adams says, I couldn't have picked a prettier bitch. Well, if it's a random event or a spontaneous event, he didn't pick anybody. There's a conflict right there in that, to me, is that he says Bobo was picked. That wouldn't gel up or mesh up with a spontaneous event of her walking out in the middle of a meth-making session.
Yeah, so I mean, Autry himself is inconsistent, and yet the state's trying to hang the majority of the case on his testimony. So you think that it's ultimately that Autry threw that in to try to jab back at the victim's family somehow?
I think there could be. I think there definitely is there. And then the incestuous comment towards Zach was definitely a shot. Zach Adams.
For him for him getting in trouble ultimately.
Absolutely, I think so. I think he was upset with Zach because if you believe all the testimony that Zach has run his mouth, got them all in trouble. Autry knows he's going to catch much lesser charges, according to the defense, and I have interviewed family. They believe he'll be home by Christmas, and Zach could be looking at the death penalty.
Yeah,
so he's planted a really heavy thing out there for a prison life for him.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the local context here. So you're on the ground, you know the people, you probably run into them at the grocery store, you pass them on the streets. What are the people like in this case? You know, we just sit here and kind of watch them at work professionally, but have you had any interaction with the prosecutors, and what can you tell us about them?
The prosecutors. Jennifer Nichols is tough. What you see in court is what you get with her. Paul is one of the best guys. He has been great to work with through the years. He will work with you, definitely.
What about the defense?
Mr. Simmons is a class gentleman, files amazing briefs. Jennifer Thompson, she's flighty. You never know which one you're going to get.
And I know you were talking about the judge here. It seems like he's got quite a personality outside the courtroom.
He does. He's an actor. He's a singer. Loves baseball. He makes the courtroom. He keeps the courtroom light, and outside the courtroom, he's jovial with a lot of us.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's just his demeanor to keep the courtroom light, to keep it moving, and to keep it light. Because he told the jurors when the first group of 500 were called, he told them about their civic duty, how responsible he was, and that it was the most important thing they could do outside of serving their country. And then he told them, I'm going to keep it light. I crack jokes. I want this process to move forward and you to be comfortable in it.
Now, I love every corner of America, and I married a woman who grew up down south. But some of us who sit here in the Northeast look at this and say, how is that becoming of a trial where there's a murder and where the death penalty is the possible penalty? Do you think it works locally in actually helping people be engaged, though?
I've heard both sides of it. I've heard, I run at the station, we have a large Facebook following, and we see it about 50-50. Why is he joking? A man's life is at stake. A young woman is dead. This is not a joking matter. So you see it both ways.
Yeah, I know that one of the judges that I worked for, I don't know if he would necessarily crack jokes in a courtroom, but he used to try to play straight with defendants, and he almost would I mean, he didn't physically do it, but it almost felt like he was taking the robe off and walking down next to him and sort of standing next to him and saying, you know, hey, look, this is what you did. This is what the law requires. I just got to level with you that this is what I have to do, but I have to sentence you. But I want you to take advantage of these programs in prison. Will you promise me that the next time I see you, it'll be at the baseball game or something like that? And I used to think that in a way, the judge that I worked for upstate had a helpful demeanor in trying to prevent someone from winding up back in criminal trouble, but I don't necessarily know as though I ever saw it come out in the middle of a trial. So maybe some of that's just what's going on here.
I think it is, and like I said, I've been following this case now for over 3 years, and from day one, he's been this way. I've tried to tell people that's just your honor.
Now, what are some of the other parties like in this? I mean, you've gotten to know the victim's family a little bit. Is there anything that you'd be willing to share with us about them?
Down here, we would just say they're good, hardworking folks. They're just good people.
Do you feel sorry for them in any way that Jason Autry sort of tried to drag the family through the mud when he was up on the witness stand?
Oh, you have to feel sorry for them. They've gone through an unspeakable tragedy, and to see Jason Autry and to hear Jason Autry say, basically, I didn't try to stop him from killing her. I just wanted to make sure the coast was clear.
Yeah, and not only that, but I was getting a little bit further into this whole accusation that their son was somehow involved in, learning how to be part of a meth cooking operation. I mean, that was a punch right to the face.
Oh, absolutely it was. And you have to sympathize with them. Of course, and once again, as we've talked about, there's different trains of thought. You see, I'd say 30-40% of the population on our Facebook sites and in public saying, I believe that story. I believe that story. This is such a sordid tale. And people believe different things in it. But it had to hurt. It had to be painful.
Yeah. Have you spent any time actually sitting in the courtroom itself, or are you watching most of this from a media room or on the feed like we are?
Up until Friday, I had not missed one single hearing over the last 2.5 years.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, we don't want to obviously identify anybody on the jury. We know the racial makeup and the gender, but what's the jury's body language been like?
They're hanging on every word at a lot of times. They're really engaged. That's one of the things, and I'm sure you've talked about it. But where Judge McGinley put all 15 of the jurors in the box and didn't select alternates, it's brought that aspect into it also, is that you have 15 people up there at times leaning over, looking and listening.
That's better than we've seen in some of the other trials, because we covered a case in Florida where there was an accusation that one of the jurors was sleeping through some of the most critical testimony. So look, I'm glad the people in Hardin County, Tennessee are taking that civic duty seriously. But, sometimes you start to pick things up when you're looking at juries, and, you can tell when testimony is either interesting them or losing them, or whether they're starting to look at the defendant with disdain, or whether they're looking at the defendant with sympathy. And, the jury's job isn't to determine what the law is. The jury's job is to determine what the facts are. And part of me wonders, if you've picked up on anything with, the jury just kind of like looking at anybody one way or the other as they've listened to this.
No, this jury just seems engaged. I'm really surprised that we're 2 weeks into it and they still seem totally engaged.
That's interesting. Because there are some cases where I've sat in a courtroom and you can look over at the jury and you can tell that from the body language that they're seeing that one piece of evidence that they needed to convict. Or they started with really open minds and they're listening to everyone, but then something happens and then bam, the jury's personality just changes completely. So if they're staying engaged all the way through, it sounds like they're really not showing their cards as to what they're thinking.
I would believe so. I sat through voir dire about 7 different sessions. We whittled from 500 down to 80, down to 15. And this jury has been engaged quite a bit. And then on final selection day, they ask very interesting questions.
What were some of them?
Some of the questions. One of the jurors, and he is on the jury without identifying anybody, he really got into the aspect of when the state said that they would introduce somebody that may have a criminal background, and he picked up on the thing. He said he called snitches and rats, and he basically said, I don't know how much, he was saying to Jennifer Nichols, why is it fair that one person could get a extreme sentence and the other person could get nothing? He said, I have a problem with that. And, there were questions like that. There were lots of questions. I was trying to think of a few more, but right now they escape me.
That's a darn good.
They were interesting.
That's a darn good question. I give that juror credit then. It sounds like they're keeping a skeptical eye on things.
There was a lot of skepticism on the jury's part. They were asking different aspects of the case, and I'm sure it's common in all over the country. But Judge McGinley encouraged them to ask questions.
You know, some of me wonders if people who live locally are worried about the way the rest of the country is seeing their community. How do you think people who are just watching this trial here on LawNewz, because people who watch LawNewz tend to like to watch trials, how should everybody who's kind of like looking in to Hardin County, Tennessee, perceive Hardin County, Tennessee?
Well, that's a great question, because I actually got that posed to me this morning by some locals, and they actually are maybe 50 miles removed, and they were like, is this way everybody is in Decatur County or Hardin County? And I was like, no, these are outliers. There's a large and growing opioid problem, methamphetamine problem, but it's an outlier. This is the defendants in this case are the exception rather than the rule.
Well, certainly. You know, so we are back in session in the Bobo court. We're going to be heading there in a second. So Burton Staggs, news director, WOPC HD News Radio, coming to us from Tennessee. Good to have you here on the LawNewz Network.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, we'll talk again perhaps.